Professor. This is Ariel Darby doing a short podcast about the three topics that I chose for class, and that was housing, culture, and poverty. Now, for the housing piece and uh, poverty, I think when we were going over in the class, when we were studying redlining, um, I felt like when I read this article, I felt like this article was the it pretty much sums up everything we talked about when it came to redlining, and um, so I won't be going into reparations, but you know, digging through this actual piece again because I actually read this last year. I started reading this again to give me some more insight about housing, and what I learned about housing was that because I had actually tried to get into real estate a couple of years ago, so I had some books and I had went to some seminars about wholesaling, and so when I was trying to get into the real estate, um, I actually had some books on it, and when I think about the migrants coming up from the south to the north, which one of those places was Chicago, and they was getting jobs and had a desire to buy a house. They were cut out of getting legitimate mortgages, and so they had to be on contract. And those contracts are what we know today as lease options, and what some people would call a rent to own. And so I started digging into what a lease option was and a rent to own, but they were using it back then between 1930 and 1960s as a predatory practice, where if you were late on the payments or you couldn't make the payment 1 month, you weren't given any forgiveness. You were pretty much your payments and all the hard work that you put in and your down payment that you put in were all gone, and they would pretty much start over with a whole new family. And so they do this today, probably has more backing from the government. They have laws that, would back you up to more today, especially since now, those that type of stuff was happening between the 1930s and probably mid 1960s, because the contract buyer league came to be around 1968, around the same time the Fair Housing Act came into play after Martin Luther King had passed away, uh, who was actually fighting for fair housing before he was assassinated. And so, with the Fair Housing Act, that um, wasn't actually enforced right away. But over time, laws have, you know, progress where you'll have more backing from the government where you don't. I mean, we're not cut out of getting an FHA loan like uh, Black migrants were in the 1930s and 1960s. Um, but I learned a lot about lease options when I started reading about this, because I actually was like, the bell started ringing in my head once I started reading about how the contracts actually work. And I started reading about how the lease options work. Because if you think about DC now, and you think about how high real estate is in DC now, a lease option would be a great deal for a buyer today, but it would not be something ideal for a buyer or seller, because we're in a seller's market today in 2021. This is pretty much a seller's market. Like, houses go like fast, but it would be great for a buyer, because it's for a buyer who can't really who can't really afford a mortgage, be it your credit is bad or that you don't have enough money to put down a down payment for a mortgage. So you have to uh, it would be good to be okay. So Screencastify gives me 5 minutes to speak and share my screen, so it was cut off. So I'm just going to combine uh, the videos. Um, so I was talking about the housing piece that I instantly thought about when I was in class studying about housing and redlining, because that's been used in this article as for the case for reparations. Um, and even though, and then when we think about Black poverty, um, I thought this point that Tasahani Post put into the article stuck out so much because I don't, much has not changed. Um, much hasn't changed when it comes to income inequality and um, who's being affected by this by this stuff. So when it says the lives of Black Americans are better than they were half a century ago, which is true, it's better. It's things have gotten better, but there are still like issues that we've had since the 1930s, 1960s that we're still dealing with today. That are just not being fixed fast enough, because I don't understand why we're still dealing with issues that we were dealing with back in 1930s, 1960s, even though things have changed and things have gotten better, it hasn't gone away. And that's pretty much the point that's being pointed out here in this article, in this section of the article, where it says the life of Black Americans are better than they were half a century ago. The white only signs are gone, and the rate of Black poverty have decreased. And then he gets into teen pregnancy and um, the gap shrinking. But the income gap between Black and white households is roughly the same today as it was in the 1970s. Um, and the children born in 1955 through 1970s and have found that 4% of whites and 62% of blacks across America have been raised in poor neighborhoods. A generation later, the same study showed virtually nothing had changed, and whereas whites born in affluent neighborhoods tended to remain in affluent neighborhoods, blacks tended to fall uh, out of them. This is not surprising. As it says, Black families, regardless of income, are significantly less wealthy than white families. The Pew Research Center estimates that white households are worth roughly 20 times as much as Black households, and that whereas only 15% of whites have zero to negative wealth, more than one-third of Blacks do. Effectively, the Black family in America is working without a safety net. So I was just like, this is crazy that this hasn't gone away. You get what I'm saying? And when I think about gentrification, especially where I live in Washington D.C., in Anacostia area, a lot of people who grew up in that area can't afford to stay in that area because incomes are not high enough to stay in those areas, and can't you know the average income for Black Americans living around there are probably about 48,000, and to stay in that area, you probably would need about 60,000, 60 to 70,000 a year. So the incomes are not increasing. Um, they're not increasing. For us to be able to catch up and stay in our neighborhoods once they get gentrified. So that's just something I could say relates back to me, and so that I'm affected by, because I make about I make about 50,000. So when I think about being from, a background that where you don't have a lot of money or you come from the ghettos that black people were subject to because they were cut out of having legitimate mortgages or whatever the reason that you come from a background disadvantage. Um, Even though you know everything bad that comes from those communities, as far as the crime rate, sex abuse, drug abuse, uh, just the neighborhood, not being upkept the way it should be. Um, the neighborhood not being kept up the way it should be. You also got to think about the creativity of, you know, the girls. They have creativity that's unmatched. We think about hip hop music for one, and hip hop is just influenced by um, the ghetto. And everything in hip hop influences fashion, the way we talk, the way we walk, the way we style, the way we dress, um, and just everything. It influences everything, and this all comes from the influence of the ghetto. So it's not all just about everything bad, but it can be about good things too. So that's the end of this podcast.